in some ways, my paper is sort of a companion piece to Philippe's first talk today. I'm talking about Roger Marston, but about very similar issues of Roger Marston's theory of perception. And the nice thing is, because of Philippe's paper, and actually also the handout, we can, I think, even better see why I think Roger Marston is more interesting than he's sometimes taken to be. And because he's often, I mean, he's well known as a student of Peckham, but I think he also has his own mind. And this paper, or this presentation, is more like going through some of the quotes with you. It's not completely polished. And also it's a part of a longer project I have. And the idea is to rehabilitate Roger Marston from his reputation and from his own style, because sort of he, there's very little research about him, and if you look at his works, you can see why, because he can be extremely annoying. But let me start setting you off with a funny quote from Coppelson, which sort of still, I think, exemplifies what people think about Marston. So here's what Coppelson says in the 50s. If Peter John Levy was an independent thinker who departed on some points from the Augustinian tradition and prepared the ways for later stages in Franciscan thought, Roger Marston, who was for a time minister of the English Franciscan province, was a wholehearted Augustinian. He embraced all the characteristic Augustinian theories, such as the intellectual apprehension of the singular thing, the preeminence of the will over intellect, universal hylomorphic composition in creatures, plurality of forms, and he criticized St. Thomas for admitting the apparent possibility of creation from eternity and for throwing overboard the rationes seminalis. Indeed, this resolute English conservative found even Matthew of Aquaspada too accommodating and firmly rejected any attempt to water down what he regarded as the genuine doctrine of St. Augustine and St. Anselm. We should prefer the saints to those infernal men, the pagan philosophers. Well, there's no debating that he used these words, pagan philosophers and infernal men, and talks often about Augustine as the saint. I think a lot of this perception comes from maybe the best known works from his corpus. He actually didn't write that much, the quadlibets and then disputed questions. I'm focusing mostly actually only on those on the soul, which of course has a famous question number 3, in which he defends the idea that that knowledge requires divine illumination. Some people here in the audience have written about this, and if you read that, you use a lot of harsh language. He accuses some people to pervert the doctrine of Aquinas, of Augustine. That's the text number 3, and to basically cut out what he says before and after, and sort of gaming the quotes. So he has in mind Aquinas' rejection of divine illumination. And if you make it even further through the question, you might get really annoyed if you read what happens in text number 4, where he says that, therefore, because I don't see how the aforesaid opinion could possibly save the intention of St. Augustine, I firmly hold that there is one uncreated light in which all true things are seen, certainly true. I mean, why should the truth of the question whether there is one light depend on an interpretation of Augustine? But be this as this may, I think that these texts sort of have created a wrong impression of someone, indeed conservative, trying only to defend Augustine's position, and I try to kind of rescue him from this interpretation by sort of trying to pass out in this longer project, which talks indeed about these 3 questions. But today I'm going to talk about question number 8 mostly, in which I try to show the philosophical project behind this. But I think one thing we owe to Marston is, I think, his insistence on the correct reading of Augustine when it comes to divine illumination is one of the reasons why later in Scotus we get this very funny or strange thing when Sudas sort of gives his account of why he doesn't think there's special evaluation to know the truth. He has an excursus in there where he tries to show that this is actually also Augustine's position, and I think that wouldn't be possible without sort of the strong view in his order among them, Marston, who hold exactly the opposite and try to show that. Okay, so this is sort of the introduction. Now let's get to what I want to talk about, namely Marston's view about perception. And in a way, we already know sort of the key ideas of his theory of perception, because he's heavily influenced by Peckham, who's heavily influenced by many other people. So a lot of the concepts we find here, like colligatio, etc., that we discussed earlier today, will reappear there. But I think before we go to the text, I think it's important to keep three things in mind that are important for definitely for Peckham, and I would say for a whole strand of Franciscan philosophers. Three key ideas that affect their views about perception. The first is, of course, that everyone shares, and these key ideas, I take it, they're considered as uncontroversial. So the first idea is that in perception, we are affected by sensible bodies in the world. So there's an impact these bodies have on the human being. That goes without, mostly without debate. The second idea is that being affected by a sensible object is not enough for perception. Usually they don't discuss that explicitly in their text, but I think they have in mind common experiences we all have. Sometimes we are affected by an object, for example. But there's some other thing happening in as well, and we are therefore not aware. So we don't attend to that impression, and therefore there's no perception. So, and for this reason, they think that they want to make a distinction between a first reception of a form or impression in the sense organ, but that is not enough for perception, and then something else going on in the sensory power, which is the perception proper. Philip has said that there's sort of there are two parts of perception. I'm not sure whether I agree with that, but you can also say that there's the perception is properly speaking only the what's going on in the sense the sense power. But be that as it may, so they're very keen on this distinction. And if you have read a lot of Aquinas throughout your life, you'll find that very difficult to start with. And then thirdly, another thing they take very uncontroversial is that if you have a perception, if you cognize something, then there is a form or species in the cognizing power which determines what you're thinking or perceiving or so about. So that's the third thing. Now, yes, so this is sort of gives us the main outline, and we can find exactly these ideas in that we found earlier today in Peckham or also in Roger Marston. And let me just show you one text where this is really nicely done because it's short. This text number 7 on the handout, where he talks about the sense organs and what's going on in the soul when we sense. He says, so therefore, cum igitur, therefore, since the air that is connatural to the ears is when the air that is connatural to the ears is excited through exterior air that is perturbated and is moved as it were by something similar to it, and the humid, the connatural humidity in the taste, in the sense organ of taste, is infected by a savory humid, and if the luminous in the object, in the instrument of seeing, is changed by exterior light or by color. Fit sensus there happens sensation through that the soul turns to such an alteration that is done, that happened in its organ, to which it is united through middle proportion, so the idea of the medium, and which it perfects. When all this is the case, then in se ipsa efficit, then the soul brings about in itself a like species. There's a typo in there, it should be specium, like species, in virtue of a natural connection, natural colligation, natural joining. Okay, so this is we discussed some of this language earlier today already. Now the problem that I think immediately arises, I mean, part of this seems to be very uncontroversial. Yes, so the sense organs, they are in a medium state. They are tied to a medium. They're related to a medium, so that's fairly standard. But is there anything we can say more about this colligatio? Why does it happen? Why is there something following from a change in the sense organ? And what we can already see in the text, he uses sort of, I think, two expressions that at the end of the day will turn out to be meaning the same. So he talks about the soul turning to such a change in the organ, and he and in the same sentence it says, and the soul brings about, efficit in se, a like species. I think at the end of the day, and maybe we'll see one or two quotes where this is the case, he thinks that the turning of the soul and the bringing about of the species are one and the same activity. Okay, so you might wonder, okay, why is there, why is there anything more to be said about this colligatio, this natural joining? Is this just sort of an ad hoc thing? Because it looks fairly ad hoc. We saw that in some of the quotes on Philippus' handout, that Peckham uses quite a different language. He also uses the term colligatio, but he also thinks that the impression or the species or the form in the organ excites or arouses something in the soul to form a species. This language is completely absent here. I'll get back to this in a minute. Okay, so is anything more to be said? I think Marston has an interesting idea to explain why there is, under normal circumstances, why the change that the soul brings about itself by forming a species in itself, why this follows sort of naturally, almost, if there's a change in the sense organ. And the idea is expressed in the next text. The language is a bit opaque because he's coming just out of a longer discussion of the De Musica. So when he talks about the occusorus numerus, just think about form here. Therefore, the soul forms of form in itself, on account of a natural joining or connection with the organ, and the proportion of the sensory power with it, i.e. the organ, according to which the power, proportion according to which the power perfects its organ, its instrument. But here's now the interesting thought. Therefore, the power is not determined through the instrument so that it determinedly senses this or that, as say some, and they say so badly, because it is not, because the form is not on account of the matter, but it is rather that the instrument itself is proportionate to the power, and according to the power of according to the capacity of the power, the instrument is conformed to it and is disposed. So the idea here is that when we think about the powers of the soul, or the instruments of the soul, they are there for the sake of the power. And if they're there for the sake of the power, then of course an affection or a change in the instrument will have some will lead to, or there's some consequent thing happening in under normal circumstances, of course, in the power, because otherwise, why would have the power such an instrument in the first place? So this is the first, and I think, important thought here. So he thinks that people who have this idea that this traditional idea that, well, the objects imprint something on the instrument, and that there's a chain, so they don't take into account the teleological nature of the relationship between the instrument of sensation and the power of sensation. And he goes on, and I think this example was mentioned already earlier today by Philippe, but here we get this with Marston's twist. And as the wax, if it had the power, the ability to apply itself to the seal and to conform itself to it, i.e. the seal, would immediately, when the seal is there, conform itself to it. So much more expressly and quickly and efficaciously can the soul conform itself through its sensitive power to the alterations that occurred in the sensory instrument, the sensory organ, of which it is the perfection. Especially since the soul is totally present in each of the parts of the organ. The power is completely present in each of the parts of the organ. And in such a way, and this forming of a species can in some way be called a reception. So the interesting idea here is like that in a way the forming of the species of the form in the power sort of follows automatically from the nature of the soul, and because the soul is attuned through the sensory powers to the instruments, etc. Again, so I when I brought in Peckham earlier, I think it's very interesting if you compare this with sort of Peckham's language, because Peckham doesn't, I mean, he uses the term colligatio, but he doesn't really try to kind of give an account what this colligatio consists in, and uses the language of excitation. But I think this language is completely absent. Only in a negative way is it present, because Marston rejects this talk of a excitatio. And I can imagine the reason I think why he rejects it is because he thinks like if you think that the impression in the organ, sense organ, if this incites so what is inciting supposed to be? It looks like almost like a efficient causally process, and that can't be. That is rejected here. But if it's less than, well, it's just a metaphor. The interesting thing is, what I think is interesting in these passages when we read sort of Marston together with his teacher Peckham, is that he has a slightly different take on these issues and tries to get rid of some of the issues, some of the key notions that are so important in Peckham, namely the idea of arousal that the impression in the sense organ plays. Yeah, you get the same idea sort of in a couple of throwaway lines. 8A is one of those. From this species, there is happens an impression in the sensory power. Now you might think, well, he talks about impression here, but wait, not that the species in the organ that exists in the organ impresses something in it, i.e. the soul or the sensory power, but from the potency that is conforming itself to the sensory organ, there is some sort of impression remaining in it, in the sensory power. Yes, so again here the idea is like there's a conformity, and so and something just follows from this. Now, okay, I hope the basic idea is clear, also because we heard about it, read about elements of this already today. I think the next question is, what exactly is the relationship between the forming of the species or the form in the sensory power and perception? Are they identical, or are they, or is that sort of a precondition? Is it something through which, in the sense of that, only if the sensory power of the soul has the species, can it then perceive or not? And I think the texts are sort of ambiguous, but since Philippe seems to agree with me, maybe I'm on safe footing here. So I actually think that the forming of the species is identical with the act of perception itself. And I think something like this can be gathered from text number 9, in which he says, "Et hoc paret." And through that, which becomes clear with respect to the second authority about the 4 species that are ordered in degrees, one after the other. Because of the species of a body, there happens to be this in the sense, i.e., he's explaining an authority. That's why he uses the language that is slightly foreign to him. Happens this which is in the sense, i.e., in the sensory organ. That which is so informed by a species does not bring about perception. Unless the sensory power, which turns to such a change, moves itself against the passions of the body by applying and conforming it itself to them. And this is the species that is first made or brought about in the sensory power. Maybe that text is less clear than we want, but so here's Philippe commenting not necessarily on this text, but text sort of around in the neighborhood of this passage, where he writes, "The sensory soul is the efficient cause of the perceptual act, rather than receiving the motion of being causally determined from the outside." So the sensory soul is the efficient cause of the perceptual act. In other words, we should not say in a proper manner the soul acts upon itself when forming the species in itself, but rather that conforming itself to the species existing in the organ makes the likeness in itself. Maybe I misunderstand Philippe here, but I thought like if this claim about the efficient cause of the perception act is another way of saying, talking about the forming of the species, then these must be somewhat identical, but not much what I'm going to say hangs on this. But there's no reason to think it's a minor point in Marston himself. He's not interested in that question that much. So why hold such a view about perception? I already said there are these 3 reasons that I mentioned earlier. they're definitely on something that drives his view, but there are also, I think, others. And one that is often mentioned has to do with Augustine's idea that there's a hierarchy of beings and that the lower doesn't affect the higher. So that's often commonly mentioned. And again, Philippe mentioned that also earlier when he talked about the motivations in Peckham. Here's another quote, and you can actually find that language in Marston himself. So he sometimes will say that well, there cannot be the species in the sensory organ cannot affect the sensory power because one is more spiritual than the other. Therefore, there's a barrier. These cannot act on each other. The one cannot act on the other. But I think there's other reasons in the neighborhood and that are important to keep in mind. This has to do with the idea that Marston and other Franciscans take very seriously, namely that perception and thinking and willing and all these things, the activities of the soul, of the agent. And if the soul is the principle of these activities, then they're also activities of the soul. Here's just one quote where he says that, but you can find these passages around a couple of times. So the worry is that if you think about sensation as just sort of a multiplication of a form from an object, let's take a red object, and then there's a form transmitted to the medium, to the sense organ, and then in the sensory power, and we have the act of sensing. If that were the case, then sensation were a purely passive process, and then we shouldn't say that sensation is an activity of the soul. It's a passion of the soul. Now, I'll just put this out there. I mean, there's some thinkers in this period who actually have bitten the bullet, and like Gottfried of Fontaine have said, like, yes, we talk about these things in terms of activities, but actually they're just passive passions of the soul. So the soul is not really active in perception; it's just receiving a form, a sensible form. But clearly, the people we're talking here, they take the ontology of mental activity from the way we speak about these events. So they're committed to the idea that it's an activity. And if it's an activity, then it has to be activity that comes from the soul itself. Now, if you hold that view, then you sort of run into other issues because it looks like that if you emphasize the activity of the soul too much, you get into the problem that you make the soul or its powers into self-movers. And at least for these authors, they wouldn't accept the idea of self-motion in unambiguous terms. And again, this is a worry that Marston is completely aware of. He doesn't want to say that, and maybe this is also another reason why he doesn't like the idea of arousal. And why he wants to settle with something that's more sort of automatic, even though leaving the agency on the side of the sensory power, because he is really worried about that when we say that the soul forms it's in itself and by itself a species, this should not be read as soul is sort of is going against the act potency axiom. So you can see this, for example, in text number 13 of the handout, where I think the worry is in the background. So he says, but one ought to say that the soul, when it forms in itself a species, it doesn't properly act in itself, but it conforms it to itself to the species that exists in an organ, in a sensory organ, which is completely present to it, etc., etc. So the worry about self-motion is diffused at least to Marston by this idea that, okay, we have this conformity, which is sort of an automatic process happening once we have an impression in the sensory organ. Okay, so this is roughly the view of sense perception. And as I said, what we find here is a mix of traditional ideas, namely the idea of colligatio, very important. And we find a tradition, this idea that we need to distinguish the impression in the sensory organ and the sense itself, or the form in the sense itself. We see some sort of criticism of his predecessors and sort of intellectual allies, namely Peckham and company, who I think for him are sort of have a problem because they're using this term of arousal that makes no sense at the end of the day. Now we can see that he now uses some of these ideas also for intellectual cognition, especially the idea of colligentia and the idea that the lower is for the sake of the higher. So in a human being, as the sense organs are there for the sake of the sensory powers, so in a way the lower sensory powers of the lower powers of the soul are there for the sake of the higher. So he will use the same idea of the colligatio and the idea that if something happens in the higher sensory powers, the idea that if something happens sort of in the sensory organ, this will lead to a forming of a species in the sensory power. He would use that also to explain how it happens that when we have that the intellect acquires an intelligible species. You can see this in text number 14 and 15. So the question 9 of the disputed questions is a question whether there are species in the mind, in the intellect, and it discusses two views which he thinks are both defective. And here's what he tells us about these views. So therefore, I believe that the four-state opinions, this is text number 14, they partly contain the truth. The first partly contains the truth in that it says that there is no species occurring in the soul from the phantasm. But what it adds, i.e. that that there is no species occurring in it, in the intellect, also in the soul, through which it understands in a simple understanding, active understanding. I believe that this goes against the truth, according in line with the arguments I mentioned above. So what he has here in mind is Henry of Ghent's idea that, well, actually, we don't need a intelligible species in the mind because we have the phantasm. And what happens when we think about an object is we just sort of use the phantasm, the universalized phantasm, and that sort of gives us the object of thought. And he thinks that, well, no. We need something in the mind itself because otherwise it's not clear what the thought is about. So in a way, the same what I mentioned earlier, what is for him a sort of a principle about cognitive powers in general applies here to the intellect as well. But let's not go into all the tricky details about this, his refutation of Henry of Ghent. But the second is a more classic view. So the second opinion in partly contains the truth. The second opinion, which says that there is a species in the soul, intelligible species in the soul. This is true in that it denies that there is some sort of species impressed through the phantasm in the soul. But nevertheless, the way in which it declares that the species happens in the soul, of this I don't approve, according to the four mentioned reasons. And what he has in mind here, again, I didn't give you the entire text, is like he discusses the normal theories of elimination by the agent intellect. And he basically thinks like, so the standard idea we can find in Aquinas so that there's a phantasm, and that gets eliminated by the agent intellect, and then moves the possible intellect. He doesn't think that that's feasible for various reasons, and maybe they rely on other things. He says they're more contentious because, after all, he thinks that the agent intellect is identical with God, and he thinks that the agent intellect and the phantasm, they just don't interact because they're such different things. Anyhow, again, we don't have to go into detail there, but now he uses the idea of colligentia that he just maybe developed sort of for sensory cognition, and goes with this also for intellectual cognition. And this you can see in text number 15. And then I'll stop. And the adeptus intellectus, and the intellect itself forms in itself a similitude of a species, as the sensory power forms in itself a species that is made in the sensory organs in through or for the sake of, because of a natural connection that it has to it. So what I said before, so he uses the exact same model for the creation of the appearance of the intelligible species that he uses for the appearance of a sensible species in the sensory power. Therefore, when the first species is acquired, the first intelligible species is acquired, the soul does not collect it by way of reasoning or abstraction. So he denies that there is abstraction by the agent intellect, but by transforming the species in the soul. So as I said, so we find him sort of. I mean, this notion of colligentia is fairly prominent in the whole entire Franciscan school. But what we find here in Marston is, hopefully surprising some of you, that he sort of develops this in a particular way, and then he runs with this idea to solve sort of the problem of transference from the sensory to the intellectual. Whether this works or not is, of course, another question. Okay, let me stop here at this point. Thanks for your attention.